Hello, and welcome. My name is Erica Garcia Abigail, and I've been a yoga teacher and yoga educator for well over 2 decades. And this is a video, um, it's a really important topic that's part of and should be part of by now every yoga teacher training, but also it's part of like the big conversations that need to continue because they this video will be part of like a 2 3 part series that I'm doing depending on how long I talk today on the subjects that I need to touch upon, which were sections that I wanted to provide my perspective as a respected yoga teacher who has been doing the best that she can, right, to navigate respecting yoga and appreciating without appropriating, and the conversations that are generally had about, decolonizing yoga, the decolonization of Western yoga. I'm not that vocal on social media. I try to be observant, right? But this is a conversation that has to be a raw conversation. And by giving my history and the ways that I've tried to address cultural appropriation in my own classes, in my own yoga studio space, whether it be in a studio or a small class or a community class or a talk that I'm doing or like, a big festival or the like, as someone who is in a training, this is a conversation to help you understand the work that you need to do for yourself and your own personal growth, your own spiritual journey, and whatever path it is that you are on as you continue your own yogic studies and are trying to build your own classes and your own yoga brand business, right? And whether it's going to be in person or virtual, this is still unlearning that needs to take place. Like I said, it's a raw conversation, so I know I may get some backlash for some of my beliefs, but I also know that I've also never been everybody's cup of tea too because of how raw that I can have some conversations. But I would be remiss that as one of the leading Latina faces in yoga that I don't provide my stance on the cultural appropriation that I've witnessed and how I've seen it evolve around me in the spaces that I've traveled in over the last 30 somewhat years. So I could only give my opinion. And know that I'm going to speak from the heart. Please know that me speaking from the heart can be real and raw for some. And if you disagree, that is totally fine. But what I would ask is that before you bash me, let's have the conversation and ask, why have you been triggered? Why do you disagree so harshly? And I ask that what the feedback that you provide, let's allow it to be constructive, so that we can continue and so that I personally can continue with my own journey because, I'm a forever student. And my intention here is not to offend anyone, but it's to educate. And also, by no means am I trying to say that I'm a guru or that my viewpoint is the only viewpoint and that my viewpoint is the only one that's correct. Obviously, every coin has two sides. And again, I'm just trying to engage and being part of these big conversations that are about yoga here in the Western world, but also now that it's dipping into more and more of Latino spaces. So it's a big overarching topic. And I would say that since the pandemic, there have been many people that have come to me so often to ask, especially as a former yoga studio owner and educator, who at the same time in the interviews have always asked, like, how have you remained such a traditionalist? And I really am. And I've also been asked, like, how you handled walking through these whitewashing spaces of yoga, especially in the early 90s and the 2000s, especially coming from New York, where I was learning my yoga. And as I keep holding 200-hour trainings and soon 300-hour trainings as well to elevate my school, I've always believed that it was important to remain true to the teachings as I interpreted them with the utmost respect, because I always understood intimately that one, most of my philosophical approach has been because I was self-taught for so many years, and because I just love to read and marinate on different philosophical views and have these deep conversations. But also two, as a yoga educator and someone who is not from any of the regions, respectfully, for the people of India, right, in Southeast Asia. And so I always knew that there was a need to be respectful for, especially for me, like even dipping a toe into trying to even create a curriculum and certify teachers in a philosophical movement, lifestyle, science that was so rich in culture and tradition that was not, let's say like of my people, right? And because this is where there's that fine line that I needed to always be aware of, and because there's a world of a difference between appreciation and passing on the rich teachings to others, and versus appropriating the information. And the last thing I ever wanted to do was ever be labeled as someone who gives the impression that, they're only trying to teach this, or that I was trying to repackage or resell anything that is not mine. And I've never claimed yoga to be mine. I've never claimed to create my own anything within yoga, right? So wholeheartedly, I've always stated that this is not my information. That's why I'm a teacher that kind of gives you everything in her pockets, right? These are not my teachings. And that these teachings are thousands of years old. They are the teachings that have helped me basically like keep my shit together, my mind, my body, my spirit, in the highs and in the lows. And I only teach what I've learned and what has worked for me. And I always give my own personal perspective, right? I can't explain, I cannot explain how I have navigated this without giving you like my own backstory with yoga and my own evolution from student to teacher. And it is only then that I can address like how you can handle some of these big topics, such as cultural appropriation, what is being phrased now as the decolonization, and quite frankly, like making yoga accessible to all without disrespecting its rich traditions, without giving you my foundation and the framework on like where I've come to see it and how it's evolved in myself, right? So let's start with the obvious. Looking at me, you can clearly see that I am Nuyorican. I am first generation born Puerto Rican, born in the Bronx of New York in 1971. And I found yoga when I was 16 years old after my mom told me that she no longer wanted me to do after school gymnastics because I wasn't competing, right? So it was like, if you're not competing, well, why are we spending this money? And so from that point on, I've always been a self-study kind of a student. And my early teacher, before Yoga Lines put in the standards, I recall being like a young kid reading and dreaming about visiting an ashram in India. I swear to you, I had to be like 16, 17 years old. And then I remember also like vividly, like then talking myself out of it. Like they barely let you take the subway into the city, Erica, to find a class that you could even take. And you are thinking about running away to go study this in some distant land. Like you're a Puerto Rican girl from the Bronx, like Bronx kids don't go to India. Like, get out of your head, literally. And I remember, I literally talked myself out of like what this dream could have been. But yet I had it as a kid, right? And so then again, that's what yoga teaches you. You need to just let it go. So, because I did often go like, what if I would have started teaching when I was 18 or whatever, right? Anyway, as an avid teacher, I knew that I needed to respect this living tradition from where it came from and who it truly belonged to. Because obviously it wasn't mine. It wasn't mine. So in the 90s, I was always seeking teachers to connect with. And when I started teaching my own little classes, I would pull from what I knew, from what I read, from all the books that I had, and from what I was reading and what I was also experiencing in my own body. And I would use my own body as a lab to create better classes. I kind of still do, right? This is kind of like my foundation. But to backtrack how I stumbled on yoga, I always give the funny story how I stumbled on it, because I remember being in my room and I would always like rough and tumble in the room and doing backflips and all that stuff in the house. And with my first yoga book, which I realize now is light on yoga because it didn't have a cover, but here I was 16 years old. I was reading, it's 1987. I stopped doing gymnastics. I'm reading this book that has all these pictures in sepia and ivory of this older, slim Indian gentleman with wearing what's like this loincloth, making all of these shapes with his body that I knew I could do too. So I would just like read how to do it, how to breathe in, da da da, and there I was, all over my bedroom. And then I always give the funny story on how, if you understand Puerto Rican culture, we are descendants of the Taino Arawak Indians that were on the island. as with the combination, obviously, with the Spanish conquistadors that brought these African slaves. And many don't realize, like, our Africans are from West Africa and especially Benin, and in particular those, that were brought to the island. So I'll give you the Cliff Note version of this really funny long story of how I found it. But basically, I was rough and tumbling around, and my bougie grandma looked at me down with her like face, and she was like, "Honey, what are you doing? Like, what is this thing?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm doing yoga." And then she looks at me and she's like, "What is this yoga, yoga, yoga? Get the yoga, yoga, yoga you keep doing?" And basically, she's looking at me like, "What the hell are you still making noise and flipping upside down and handstands against my wall, dirtying my walls or whatever, when the rest of your cousins are just sitting here calmly and they're just doing their homework and watching TV? Like, why can't you just keep still?" And my grandma and my aunt were like my main babysitters growing up, and like I said, the rest of my cousins are like sitting there, playing with each other, whatever. And I was always like skirt, shorts, pants. I was always upside down, right? And I know, I drove them crazy. And so I remember it because she was like, "Where are you getting this from? Can we just stop for a minute? Can you, like, where are you getting all this from?" And so I said, "From the book." And I show her this book, and she looks and she's like, you can see her face is like, "Oh my God, how do I tell this kid nicely?" And then she just blurted out like, "Ay, mija, estás bien equivocada. Esos no son los indios de nosotros. Los indios de nosotros son los taínos, no estos indios. Estos indios son, like, de bien, bien, bien antiguos, bien de allá, 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 bien lejos. No son de la isla." Basically, what she was saying was, "Oh my God, my poor child, we told you we were black, white, and English and Indian, but you got it wrong. Like, when I told you that's what our mix was as Puerto Ricans, well, you picked the wrong Indians. These aren't our Indians. Our Indians are the Arawak Tainos that were here in the island. These Indians are like the real Indians from, like, a real far distant land, the ancient Indians from another place, the other side of the world. These aren't the ones that were here. You're connected with the wrong peoples." And all she could do was laugh. She was like, "Oh my God, I told her Indian, look where she went with this," right? But you know what? They were the ones I connected with because I can tell you that she realized also then that it was too late. Like, I was already falling in love with it. At the same time, she wanted to just make sure I knew, right? Like, you're not those people, right? But she left me alone, and she was like, "Well, she's not in the streets, she's not doing whatever, she's rough and telling what she's always been doing or whatever." And so that's like my real big exposure to movement, right? Because I was so used to always moving. As a kid, I was a dancer, then I was in gymnastics, and I realized that when I'm in movement is when I feel whole again. And it was the first thing since stopping doing gymnastics where it helped me get back in my head and connect with my breath, connect with myself, and that voice that was in my head that was always peaceful and comforting and empowering. And as in the 80s, there were latchkey kids, right? And I was a latchkey kid. I would get home, after school, let myself in. My mom would go to work. She worked evenings or whatever. And, it was lonely as a kid. But I knew that when I moved, I didn't feel lonely and I felt alive. And I knew that the voice that was with me, I would have these, like, long conversations. And I realized later they were like conversations with God. And it was always like when I was upside down or when I was afraid, and I would just move to shake things off. That was my yoga. And it was hard to explain it back then, but here I am 38 years later, still moving. And it's because that I know what yoga, true union of the mind, body, and spirit, where it came from organically for me was connecting that, movement with the breath in a different form. But here I am later, and that's what I still do. And then fast forward in my late 20s, I was working in Wall Street, I was working in finance. And, well, there's no other way to say it other than, yeah, hello, I'm a survivor of 9/11. I'm one of the ones that ran out of those buildings. And I will tell you that it was very hard on me mentally and emotionally. And that was a very big healing journey, especially with my own PTSD. And I realized then, whoa, I need to go back into my yoga practice deeper, because that's the only time that I feel control over my body, mind, emotions, my spirit, and where I feel connected, because everything was so disconnected at that time. And I needed to use the breath and the movement to slowly regain peace with all the chaos that was going on within me and around me. And it became part of the reason why I started to teach, because I realized, wow, how deeply healing it was. So I kept studying. I started teaching little classes to people who were watching me just do my own thing. I started to find some of the most respected teachers that I can find. And then I just taught open level classes everywhere. And but also because I was also searching, what I realized, I was constantly searching for a space that felt authentic. Yeah, I was going to a lot of places. I was meeting many lovely teachers who gave lovely classes. But what I noticed were a few things. I was in New York, and there was a lot of moving parts. But one of the things I noticed was that all the teachers I came upon, no one was authentically, East or Southern Asian or people of India, right? They weren't of that true descent. So I was looking for, like, where are the traditional teachers? And then two, I'm in New York at this time, and I could only find two types of classes. There were like the studio spaces that were respectfully whitewashed. They would be full of dancers. They would be full of actresses that were taking their classes like on their downtime to stay in shape. And I could sense that when I walked into these spaces, I wasn't part of the crowd. I wasn't part of the clique. And they would very passively, aggressively, they would take my money and, escort me to the room with that smile and overtone of the vibration of like, honey, what are you doing here? Right? They knew I clearly wasn't an aspiring actor. I wasn't a dancer in some major company. And quite frankly, I weighed more than 100 pounds. And I knew who I was, right? I was a thick, athletic, curvy Hispanic girl who took the subway in, just trying to go and do some yoga. And so honestly, I didn't really care because I knew who I was. And I knew that once I got on the mat, I was strong enough and I was flexible enough to stand toe to toe with any dancer or whatever who was wrapping their leg this way, doing handstands or whatever. So I didn't care about that. It wasn't a competition thing for me. But I grew up, honestly, thankfully, in a time where Mary Lou Retton was like the gold medal gymnast in the Olympics, and my body looked like hers. So I at least had somebody to look at to say, okay, you stand strong and confident. We're being okay with this type of body, because I've had this body since I was a teenager. I was like solid and diesel. Um, so if I wasn't in one of these kind of studios, then usually I would find yoga being taught in like a community hall or a church basement. And while these teachers, again, they were really lovely, they just typically weren't the type of teachers that I would have taken a class with. And usually they were at least a teacher that took one trip to India and came back with, with what they knew, whatever. But respectfully, they were a little too Woodstocky, granola crunchy feeling for me, for this Bronx kid, right? They were very, love and light, and they just weren't for me, and that's okay. There's always going to be a teacher for you, and so like I didn't mind taking the class, but I stayed on the hunt. Who can I connect with? Who can connect with? Where can I find a vibe where I can feel like I can grow? And I wanted a good yoga teacher to take me further in what I was already teaching myself, without the competition, without the culty feeling, without the hokey pokey, without the leftover hippie vibes. Like, I just wanted a good teacher that spoke regular English to me, right? And took out all the dogma. So I knew that my road was going to be a lonely one from back then. And I didn't find one until, like, it was like the Robert Frost poem, right? Until I created my own road less traveled. I always knew that I agreed with Robert Frost that the road that I was going to have to take was going to be long. It was going to be lonely. I was just going to have patience and faith and trust in God's timing, but it was going to be worth it. And then I later read the Gita, and I'm like, oh my God, this all sounds so familiar. These are like the teachings of the path of the soul. And, anyway, I digress. It brought me back to another place. So I would have to say the first time I actually met someone of color, not only doing yoga, but also teaching it, and was so well respected and revered, was when I went to Kripalu the first time. In 2008, I went to take the Yoga for Youth training with the esteemed Krishna Kar. And it was then that I was in Kripalu, and I was like, okay, this feels like an ashram, but it doesn't feel like an ashram, but I can feel the sincerity and the humility of the teachings and the teachers. And yes, of course, I was with a teacher of color, so I felt like I knew I was getting closer. And then from that point on, I continued to teach my open level classes. I was under her mentorship for quite some time, to the point that I started to teach for her. And then I rose up to being Krishna's New York City regional director for yoga for youth, in the New York City region, where we did all of the schools and the juvenile detention centers. And I was the director up until I decided to open up my own yoga studio in the beginning of 2012. So I would say from like 2009 to 2012. And we traveled to Africa together, and we did a lot of wonderful work. And many have asked me, why did I want my own studio? And to be quite frank with you, it was because I came from that space, and I had already been teaching for years. And at this point, I was now teaching one-on-ones in my one-bedroom apartment. And I wanted to get people out of my private home, because that was my sanctuary. And I figured if I got people out of my home, then I could start building a community. And I had been traveling abroad by this point. I was doing a lot of volunteerism, and all the volunteer events. And everywhere I went, every other country I went to, I would teach yoga, and it was so received. It was so well received. And I was teaching it more from the space of skills of resilience and breath and whatever. And those were the only places I saw diversity, because I was putting myself in diverse places. So I was like, you know what? I'm in the Bronx. There's diversity here. Why don't I just do it? And why not me? Like, why can't I be the one that opens the studio? So that's what I decided. So here I am. I'm opening up my studio. I claimed opening up my studio at the end of my 200-hour training, and I claimed it. And I put on my vision board December of 2011. I will always remember. I was like, I'm opening up my studio. And I have to tell you, it's like a teaching moment of dharma, because I knew that I just wanted to teach good yoga to regular everyday folks, my neighbors. Essentially, I wanted to practice and teach in a space that everyone was welcome. Everyone was embraced the moment they walked in, no matter what size, no color, creed, gender, accessibility, and basically whatever box the rest of the world put you in my space, or what you put yourself in my space, those boxes didn't exist. We were all together on the mat, moving with one breath. And we were going to crush these boxes. And if somebody put a roof over your head, we were raising the roof. We were blasting through it, because that's what I did. And so I claimed it in December of 2011, and I opened my doors literally February of 2012. And when I tell you the whirlwind of circumstances and divine timing, it was like Moses parting the Red Sea of synchronicities that took place from the moment I declared it to the moment I opened the door. That's another lecture, but it's totally resonates when you trust in your dharma and you trust in alignment with your path. Like, literally, God makes all those miracles happen, and it happens very fast. It's very scary. You got to put your seatbelt on and just trust. Know that this is what you're supposed to be doing. So the foundation and the mission of my studio, the vision, was that I knew that the only way for it to come to life was to build from my heart. And most of all, that I needed to remain true to who I am. I knew this early on, that I'm the brand, I'm the face of it, right? And that they're coming to take class with me. I taught the first 22 classes a week for the first like almost year. And I knew, okay, I'm over 40, I'm big haired, salt and pepper haired, I'm curly, I'm a loudmouth, sarcastic Puerto Rican from the Bronx. And I knew that I needed to become comfortable in my own skin, so that I could give those who walk through those doors permission to be comfortable in their own skin too. And I proudly have been calling myself perfectly imperfect for decades, like before it even became like a slogan. So it was so nice that like now I can see it like on a shirt or something. But I've been saying it for years, because with that, I will start with that. I created a studio with a Spanish name, Nueva Alma. Everybody told me not to do it. Nueva Alma translates to new soul. And I said, that's going to become a new norm. If anybody learns two Spanish words, they're going to learn new soul. And I knew that New York City was already saturated with studios, but the Bronx didn't have any. And I also knew that I wanted to tap into Westchester, New York as well, because I was on the border. So I strategically opened it on the border of the Bronx and Westchester, but on the Westchester side in Yonkers, New York. And then now, if you know Yonkers, I decided, okay, let's say if there's any big street to be on, like the Broadway and Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue of Yonkers, everyone knows it's McLean Avenue. And I opened it on McLean Avenue, which is the heart of Ireland in Westchester. I mean, it is where all of the Irish immigrants have settled. And it literally, and on that street, you could, I don't know, there's like a lineup of like maybe 30 pubs or so. It's fantastic. And everybody told me like, it's not going to succeed. You're in an Irish neighborhood. You got a Spanish name. Look at you. Like, why there? Why that name? But I just knew that if I came from my true heart space, and everyone who walked in can feel that I was being a traditionalist, I was respecting the roots, I was respecting the teachings, that they would resonate with that. And so fast forward, we blew up. We moved locations. We went from one room to two rooms, from two rooms to a storefront. I became a school in 2016. And the only reason why we closed was because of COVID and the timing ending of my lease, that I quickly realized, oh, wait, COVID's going to last more than 2 to 4 weeks like they're predicting. And I need to renegotiate a lease. If not, we need to find a new location. And I'm proud to say that by the time that I closed, we were part of the pulse of the neighborhood. We were on the Merchants Association. I had well over 4,000 people come through my doors, traveling from New York City to from New Jersey, from Westchester, and even Connecticut. They used to come on a regular basis to take class with us. I hosted many esteemed yoga legends, as like Tao Portion Lynch. She used to love to teach in our studio, and I had trained already about 70 yoga teachers. Little old me, could you believe? And several were of Indian descent. And I would have to say one of the biggest compliments when they would come to me to like sign up for teacher training. I remember asking one of them, I was like, why me? Are you sure? Like me? And I remember her response was, yeah, because you're the first teacher I've taken class with that's taken true yoga. And actually, I have to even tell you, my mother would be so proud with the way you pronounce chakra. And respectfully, that you're not teaching all this fluffy stuff. And that when we're doing like mantras, you're like rocking the Sopurik and the Gayatri with us ladies in the proper times. And, they loved it. And by the time we closed, I have to tell you, we had in attendance in almost every class, every shape, every size, every age, every creed, every gender identification, every religion, and accessibility. Because, yes, on a regular basis, I had the priest from the parish taking yin classes, and I had a double amputee that used to take the chair classes and the Iyengar classes with everyone else, just like they were just like everyone else, because everyone was welcomed, everyone was seen, and everyone was respected, and we were the community. We were the hum of this is what it should be. So when we closed, I had not realized that part of the success was just being me. I didn't realize that I was the first yoga teacher for many. I was the first director of yoga teacher training, the first yoga studio that many had even gone to. And then on top of the first of all that, check off the additional boxes. I was a woman. I was a minority woman of color. I was curvy. I was over 40. I was over 100 pounds. I mean, the list can go on. And I couldn't believe it because I was just doing me, right? So now here I am. It's 2023 and 2025, and I'm still teaching. I'm still plugged into the community, but I'm now located in Puerto Rico, but I still go back to Kripalu. And what a beautiful full circle, right? I still go back to Kripalu, but now I'm one of the one teaching in this big organization and these big yoga spaces that are still keeping diversity alive and keeping teachers like me thriving and in the forefront of what it looks like to be diversity in yoga. And I attribute my success to yoga. I attribute my success to respecting yoga and the rich traditions and the science and this living tradition, because we are all human and all of us can benefit from yoga. Every human on this planet. It is such a beautiful, I wish everyone was given this gift of yoga, at least allowed themselves to be gifted this gift of yoga. I believe yoga, particularly meditation, should be taught in every early education facility, every prison facility, especially in high schools and colleges, maybe a version of a 200-hour training or like as an elective, particularly the philosophy, because I think it would help just so many children. I am so grateful that I found it at 16 years old. I'm going to be 54 now, right? And it helped me with the biggest life questions as I was growing up, like, who am I? How can I serve? Where can I find contentment, even when life is pretty shitty right now? It gave me discipline. Taught me cleanliness, not being harmful, not being greedy, not stealing, having trust and faith in God, evenness in my relationships and boundaries, and how to find more meaning in my life. I don't want to suffer. Nobody wants to suffer. We're all just looking for peace and happiness and joy. And all of these teachings in yoga, especially the yamas and the niyamas, they just give you this moral foundation of just living well and being at peace and helping the world be better, because we're just better human beings that just want to contribute, not to just the I, but being good citizens, understanding cause and effect, and how we impact the world at large. um, and I believe, like I said, that everyone can use these teachings from young, because they are non-dogmatic. It's not a religion. So it will be so helpful, because these young kids will not fall and succumb to these Western societal, like social media, that is just like killing their self-esteem before they've even had a chance to blossom into their own. um, so here we are, very long-winded journey as to why I started this lecture. But many have asked, how did you make sure that you did not appropriate the culture and the teachings of yoga when in your studio spaces, when you're holding classes and lectures? How is it that you did it? And so I really wanted to give it some well thought out time to kind of create like a list for you, but not really like a list, but more of like overarching themes to consider. Because obviously, this list is not limited to what I'm about to teach you, right? But it should serve as good starting points for really good, rich dialogue and debates, right? So let's start with like the themes, right? So, how to address cultural appropriation in yoga classes. How can we avoid it, right? Um, so I would say let's start with coming from a space of being a teacher who comes from the space of education, right? You want to educate. You want to gently educate with clarity. You want to be clear, right? So as a yoga teacher, you should always be furthering your education. You should always be studying. And if your training didn't provide you with the amount of time to really give you a nice breadth of knowledge, in-depth study of the Vedas, it's your responsibility as a teacher to continue these studies on your own. This is a lifelong journey, right? And that's how you'll create safer spaces in your classes, so that you can continue, and you should educate your students with compassion, with clarity, because it is your responsibility also to dismantle the misconceptions that they're coming into your space with, right? And who is it for? Who's starting out with you as students? The number one thing you have to tell them is that it's not fitness, right? You're doing this for yourself. And you're doing this to, if you don't teach the richness of the philosophy and the science, you're doing everybody a disservice, because they're going to come in looking like, I just want to learn to do a handstand. And yes, I get it. Well, there are points of entry, and there are probably at this point hundreds of types or categories of yoga. Traditionally, you should be teaching it as a full system, regardless of which entry point they're coming in. And many of them don't even know where to come in from or what they come in from. So if you're just already embodying living the 8 limbs as a lifestyle for yourself, then you can lead by example, and your teachings will be much more authentic, because you're teaching what you know, right? So when I remind you that you need to remind them that this is not a fitness class, remember, asana is the third branch of yoga. It's the third. You can't come into the house on the third floor. You got to come in through the first floor. The first floor of the house are the yamas. And then you move to the second floor of the house, the niyamas. Then you go to the third floor, which is the movement practice. But there's still so much that you had to do to get there. And remember, once you've gone through the breath, right? Then you go into breath, pranayama, the breath work, and then you move to sense withdrawal and concentration. All for what? So that you can sit in meditation. That's what asana means anyway. And why do we want that? So that we can find bliss, peace. It's simple steps. It's a simple science. And when you educate from very simple steps, non-dogmatically, then it becomes a lot more digestible and more in alignment with whatever the tradition you're teaching, whatever philosophy they come, whatever religious dogma they're coming in with. You can dismantle all of that. And you can start with short, quick explanations of its origins and the purpose of what you're doing. That's what sets the tone. For example, like, welcome everyone. As you know, yoga is about 5,000 years old. It comes from, Southeast Asia. It's a spiritual path for liberation. And as we move today, I want you to remember we're engaging into something sacred. I know that many of you are coming here for various reasons. Who's coming in to deal with some stress and some anxieties? Someone's perhaps in this room is dealing with some grief or heartache, and many of you have come to me saying that your doctor told you to come, or maybe you're here because your friend dragged you along today. But let's just, I don't know why you're here, but you're here, and all I ask is that you just try for today, give it your best. And let's just use your breath as you're moving to anchor you, to keep you here right now. That's it. And I don't care if you can't touch your toes, but you can breathe, right? And I just want to provide you, as we're moving, I will provide you with multiple variations of the poses for you to play around with and decide which is the one that's going to feel good for you today and now. And I really do want to thank you for giving this class a try, because if at any point you feel overwhelmed, which some of you may or may not, I want you to know that you always have agency over your body. And by all means, if you need to rest, I invite you to lay down in Shavasana and just settle your body and mind. Try to stay awake and still listen to my words. Let them feed your dialogue, right? Feel the sensations that are going in your body. And just stay with your thoughts, stay with your breath. Give yourself permission to relax. When you're ready to rejoin the class, you can. If you need to stay there for the remainder of the class, that's it as well, because that is a pose. And just do nothing more, nothing less. We have enough pressure outside the door waiting for us. But for now, let me support you. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy this journey. And then smile as you're saying all this, and go on with educating and teaching your class with sincerity and compassion. Trust me, it goes a long way. The next thing I wanted to talk about is that if you're going to use your voice and your likeness and a platform, then use your platform to uplift and not rebrand yoga. Avoid renaming poses for trendiness, like booty burner lunge, or I don't know, hip hop, whatever, right? Don't trivialize the symbols, om symbols on socks, or use words like namaste instead of namaste. Please don't do that. Be a teacher who teaches from a place of reverence, not reinvention, and certainly not reinvention for capitalism or to become famous and an influencer. Please don't do that. I can't tell you how many times I have rolled my eyes and bit my tongue and silently, like literally gone to a corner and prayed to the sages, like, I am so sorry this is happening. When someone has brought up that they love goat yoga, puppy yoga, cat yoga, drunk yoga, 420 yoga, like anything that's going to alter your states and change what yoga should be, right? I'm not even going to touch on the music part, because there is a time and a place when, yes, you should be using music and you can use music. But again, this is only my opinion. My opinion is that if you're going to be using it, you're using it for a purpose. I prefer that we use sound healing modalities versus like the latest top 40 hits and trends that you can hear on the radio. Remember, you're trying to teach people to be present in their bodies. And if they're singing, then where are they? They're outside of their bodies, they're outside of their heads. And you're not being able to bring them into an internal journey. But you can play kirtan, you can play chant. So there's a way of using it, right? So choose teaching from appreciation and reverence versus trends. And always remember, if you want to implement something new, why do you want to implement that something new? And then offer context in your classes. What I mean is, for example, when guiding classes, teach the Sanskrit word. Teach a Sanskrit word of the asanas. And if you've learned like the mystery, the myth, the history, whatever, then do that too. Teach it. Like Shavasana, traditionally, this pose symbolizes letting go of killing the ego and preparing to be rebirthed. That is why we explain that Shavasana is the awakened state of dying. Because when we come out of it, what do? We rebirth ourselves coming into fetal position before we sit up. That's what Shavasana is. Shavasana is not, oh, great, I'm going to take a nap at the end of movement time, right? And you should be teaching that to the students that they can aim for staying in rest in order to merge this physical, gross, and subtle body with the breath for these final movements of moments of yoking, huge yoga, right? That's what this is. It's a pose. If you have someone who tends to fall asleep all the time, then speak to them compassionately. Say, you're robbing yourself of this wonderful experience because it's not going to sleep time. This is a pose. There's still three poses. There's Shavasana, fetal, and then getting up. So when you offer it more with context, then even in your flows, you can explain the translations of the Sanskrit words. Something as simple as vinyasa. V means special, nyasa, to place in a certain order. So if you're doing a vinyasa, we're actually consciously linking a pose with a pose in a special order, in a special programming, using the breath and movement in a flowing sequence. That's what vinyasa means. It doesn't mean choreography. It doesn't mean what I call yoga acrobatics. Vinyasa is that framework, that sequence that the teacher has thoughtfully created to weave and integrate the intention, the breath, the alignment, and create this meditative, purposeful practice for a reason. And I mean, just giving that context alone, I can't tell you how many students have looked at me like I have four heads and said, oh my God, no one ever broke that down from the Sanskrit word and explained it that way to me. And it makes just that understanding of the word vinyasa makes you as a teacher want to sequence better. And remember, why am I doing this? Why? For what outcome, right? So all this falls in line with what I've been trying to elaborate is that if you teach from the mindset of truly growing your students in their practice, then you aim to educate more clearly and in the context from what yoga is from the traditional framework. And that is not appropriation, it is reverence and appreciation. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Because I'm not done. Okay, so now that we've touched that, there are a few other overarching themes that I wanted to touch upon that as a yoga teacher, you should, you should aim for, right? So, like, let's aim for avoiding cultural tokenism. Hello. I know this one may upset some of you that have like small pop-up shops, but there are some of these examples need to be addressed, right? What I mean is by cultural tokenism is you need to be authentic in what you're doing, what you're selling, what you're wearing, and what you're representing at all times. And if it's not true to you, then you should aim to avoid it. If you're wearing a head wrap, like mine is right here, I wear head wraps all the time. I know the purpose of why I'm covering my crown. And that one can be translated to many cultures and many religions as to why you should be covering your crown during certain times of prayer and meditation. I've been covering my crown since I was a child. In my culture, it's very common to cover your crown. And so I know why I'm doing it, but you should know why you're doing it and when you're doing it, right? Don't wear bindis. Please don't do that. I admit at one point I used to have a bindi bar in my studio. I got rid of that the moment I learned better, right? And we used to have bindi parties. We used to put them at the end. We used to do henna tattoo parties. We used to do all that. But then I realized this isn't decor. This means something in celebratory times. And there's a fine line. And I'm never saying never, but what I'm saying is there are times and places for certain things where you can, because you're engaging in a ceremony or celebratory thing where, yes, a bindi is appropriate, the henna is appropriate. That's what I'm saying. Use it when it's appropriate. The other big one are mala beads. Have you counted how many beads are in your necklace or bracelet, right? Because mala beads are prayer beads. And if you're wearing them, are you wearing them because you found them pretty, or are you wearing them for a reason, which is, again, devotion, right? Remember, a mala is a simple string of prayer beads that are used in a japa meditation to count mantras, to count your prayers or intentions. A full mala should be 108 counted beads. A half mala is 54, and a wrist mala is 27. If it's not those numbers, it's jewelry. So please count your beads, and remember, these are symbols of prayer and devotion, not a trend. Then there's even something as simple as using, and I think I mentioned it earlier, like namaste, but even namaste or satnam. These are greetings, but if you don't know the context, don't use them. It's almost like aloha if you were in Hawaii. Everybody just takes it and then it's like, no, it's not a fun thing to do. Have the reference and explain to them and choose what you're going to use and incorporate meaningfully in your practice. Because as you begin to embrace a more holistic and yogic lifestyle, you will embrace some of them if you're truly interested. But don't like, um, oh, I'm doing this because my favorite influencer does it and learn by Googling. No, seek a mentor and guidance from an elder in the culture and know what that token or likeness really truly means before you think you just want to adopt something that you really don't know. And how do you grow as a yoga teacher that doesn't appropriate the culture or yoga and its rich traditions? Like, you just need to be open to always be learning and unlearning your own biases, your own stereotypes, your own misgivings and overtones, because we all have them. So always welcome dialogue and reflection. And join these community discussions, host these community discussions about yoga roots, and their modern use, modern how to do it again. Attend workshops, attend webinars, move outside of your comfortable circles because the learning happens outside, right? And be open to feedback, especially from students and especially from students from South Asian heritage. Absolutely, this is their culture, right? So, how can you make small shifts in your current offerings or in the dialogues that you're engaged in? Listen, you just need to lead with intention, right? If you're leading with intention and you're not accusing and you keep your tone grounded, open hearted, sincere, and curious, then you can start framing the conversations as opportunities for collective growth and awareness and not a judgmental or bashing thing, right? For example, if a topic does feel like a little too sensitive, but it's important for us as yoga teachers, then you need to reflect on how can we honor the roots of the practice with integrity, and how can I approach this elder in the community or someone in that this is their tradition to learn better. Everyone always wants to teach when someone's sincere, right? And you want to use inclusive and compassionate language. Let's say, like, let's explore together how we can respect yoga's roots. Welcome the compassion. Welcome the compassionate feedback as well. You have to remember we're all learning, all of us. And cultural appropriation often happens unconsciously, for many of us, myself included, right? I'm always unlearning. So we have to keep learning and unlearning. We just have to keep putting ourselves right at that front line. And it's not about blame, it's about remaining aware and remaining humble so that we can honor and, yes, acknowledging and apologizing when we need to, because sometimes we can offend, again, unconsciously, but it will come out. And you need to commit to doing better. Like, so your apologies, you need to have actions with it to show that you are trying to be better, right? So you want to avoid like harsh accusations or even generalized statements like, oh, Westerners always steal our culture, or, you know, uh, generalizing or gaslighting, like, well, this is how it's always been done, or I come from a different timeline, this is how it's always been, with that rigidity of like you're just not interested in changing. And and shaming people, no, that's not good either, right? There's no shaming of people for not knowing better. If someone doesn't know better, use it as an opportunity to educate clearly and compassionately. Same thing for you. You want that back, and that's the only way we're going to move forward in a very united way, right? And remember, when educating, you don't want to lecture, you don't want to be overbearing, right? You want to offer gentle definitions, such as like cultural appropriation is when elements of a culture are borrowed without understanding, without giving the credit where credit is due, without respecting them, especially when the original culture, you haven't done your history work and you didn't realize like they've been facing marginalization for years, centuries. So you want to provide concrete examples. Like, if you're going to be using namaste and you've been using it correctly, then stop. If you've been turning your yoga into a brand or a fitness trend, stop. Stop selling the merchandise once you finish selling it all, and move to something that is really looking to balance out your offerings with alternatives that, like, instead of renaming the poses, stop trying to rename it. Just go back to the Sanskrit. It's a third language anyway, and really understand the vibrational meaning underneath it. Do that. That's more authentic, right? Um, and acknowledge your own learning journey. Model vulnerability. I've made these mistakes a bazillion times, and I'm going to continue. Um, but I've never not taught yoga without honoring its roots. But sometimes you may do something that, after reflection, you go, "Ooh, I could do better." And that approach makes others feel safe that you're listening, and you're not listening to defend, you're listening to learn, and to do better. And when you can, and when you're looking for collaborations, podcasts, whatever, without a doubt, you should be looking for connections that you can make with other South Asian teachers and respected scholars. Get out of your immediate group. Look where you can highlight South Asian voices and their experiences, BIPOC teachers. You want to share writings and videos, and you want to share the quotes of South Asian scholars and teachers who are speaking on the topics. And remember, we're in a space of like a quick share on social media, but you need to remember it's not a simple share. You need to be respectful. So when you're sharing someone's post or reel, you should be using like verbiage like, "Hey, here's a perspective from a respected South Asian yogi that has helped me understand this a little bit more deeply." And yes, tag them and thank them for what they've just shared and what you learned. That's actually a beautiful offering. And invite reflection, not reaction. Engage in conversations. Use the open-ended questions in a class to engage discussion. So I ask all of you, like, how do you, having listened to this, how do you think we can all be stewards of yoga's rich traditions in this modern society, in this modern way of teaching? And what are ways that you may have been unknowingly contributing to this cultural appropriation that now that you've listened, you're like, whoa, I can probably do this a little bit better. And then lastly, you know, I just said it, you want to follow up with actionable steps. So as you're learning, gather lists of being able to, so you can offer resources and suggestions and encourage reading traditional texts. Recommend workshops or webinars by other South Asian scholars, and someone that you've learned something from, right? And personally, as you're sequencing and learning to theme out your classes, seek ways where you can include more of the philosophy, more of the Sanskrit, more of the stories, more of the history. And if you're in a studio setting, maybe you can do like a theme of the month, or you could even suggest ways to restructure this classes or workshops, even to the owners if you're not the owner. Like, hey, I'd like to run this by you. I'd love to have this class or this workshop that also includes more philosophy, more history, blah, 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 and show them how you're looking to grow the students. Well, I've spoken a long time. This is a heavy topic, I know, but it's one that needs to be addressed. And I really hope that I was able to bring it to you in a way that is really digestible information for the better of all of us. And it empowers you to like ask the questions and seek more education for yourself and your students. And I hope I made this video with enough grace for you all to really hear my sincerity. Remember, we're teaching people, not poses, right? And each person's going to come to you before your class. They're going to come with their own history. They're going to come with their own biases and stereotypes and misconceptions. And you, as the teacher, you want to lead by example and be a wonderful and a true resource for them on their learning journeys. And when you hold these teachings sacred, then you're already on the right direction, and they will feel it and you'll feel it. So thank you again all for listening. And I do welcome feedback, but please be kind. Be kind to me if you have, let's have dialogue if you disagreed with anything. And teach me if there's something else that I may have missed that you would find relevant. Thanks. Have a great day.